Howdy folks, we're looking at Edge Magazine issue 38, November 1996. Of course, discussing the future of interactive entertainment. And here's an album, not an album cover, a magazine cover I quite like. Altogether, you see what seems to be a record playing on a disc jockey set. So that's cool. Unfortunately, the topic is not a huge interest to me. Of course, Wipeout 2097, also known as Wipeout XL in the States, was a cool game, but this is also a lot about the sound and the hipness of music in video games, something that was a thing in the late 90s for the PlayStation 1 brand, but other than that, lived a short life, and Edge loves it, coming from England, where most of the techno music used for the Wipeout series was used, but the whole new media thing, I never thought it made that much sense. If anything, it meant that video games were looking back instead of forward, because video games are a new medium, CDs and the like are an old one. But okay, so Edge is all really happy about how the video game culture is now totally cool and hip instead of being only nerdy and geeky. But I don't think that was for the better, to be honest. Here we have a popsicle which says, "What runs along a cliff but never moves?" I'll give you time to think about that. So this issue has, well, Trip Hawkins, we'll get back to it later. Ecstatica 2. Yeah, we'll see if we carry on. Tokyo Game Show 1996, showing off future hits coming from Japan, like Soul Edge, what I believe is Rage Racer. Capcom would have Resident Evil 2. There's, of course, Final Fantasy VII, a big hit for the PlayStation 1. And, yeah, some quirky arcade titles. We have Turok Dinosaur Hunter, even though that was an American game, I believe, wasn't it? So the Nintendo 64 having bad news. Apparently they can't sell the Japanese versions. This is actually a rumor. I'm not sure if it actually was the case, but of course they could use that to sell them in the United States. Nintendo 64 showing off some new titles. Mario Kart 64, Wave 64, and Star Fox 64. So the future looking bright for the company. Interview with Howard Lincoln. A lot of criticism about the system not selling well. And Lincoln basically has the final word, saying, well, we have Super Mario 64, and we're going to be making more awesome games. There's also Gooman 5, which looks great. I think it also played very well. And Blast Corps would be awesome. Shadows of the Empire had a fantastic opening level. Other than that, it was rather bland. Jammin' 96 with Konami and Capcom arcade games. I love the skiing game, Super Giant Shell. I think it was called otherwise. Hold on, no, I like the Namco skiing game. Code Azure, I think it was called. Yeah, that was an awesome racing game. Didn't like the 3D Street Fighting games though. They were slow. Here's the CP3 system for Capcom with Warzard, aka what's it called? I don't know. Wasn't a big hit, but humongous sprites, and later that technology we used for Street Fighter 3, one of the greatest looking 2D games ever made, especially the animation. Here's some more talk from George Sacker. We've seen him before. He worked for Silicon Graphics, and he talks about how the amount of polygons that can be calculated isn't a big deal anymore. It's more about what you do with those polygons, considering Z-buffering, Garud shading, etc. Yeah, that's basically the gist of what I have to say. It seems to be like kind of a column now. Give an opinion of what the industry will be like. Here's an interview with Mr. Sony in Japan. What's his name again? I can't seem to find it. Oh yeah, Terry Tokunaka. I don't know. I'm not very familiar with him. And he's talking about how great Tekken has sold. And he seems to be very polite about the success of the Super Mario 64. Nevertheless, optimistic about the PlayStation 1. And well, there's one question which I find interesting. How will you manage to increase the number of women who play games? And he says, I'm testing theories every day with my wife. Well, anyhow. Sure, a very sexist commercial here. And then we have this, which has nothing to do with video games, but it's graphics nonetheless. We have a profile. So finally we have a profile of a woman in Edge, and who is it? Well, it's a virtual idol consisting of a lot of pixels, so polygons, so this wouldn't work on the Saturn PlayStation. I never heard of her anymore. Kyoka Date, I don't know. Maybe I should look it up. Maybe I shouldn't have. Andrew Spencer apparently works for, what was it again? The people making Ecstatica 2. So, Andrew Spencer Studios apparently. We'll look more into the game later on. And here's the best part of the magazine. Trip Hawkins, just after he sold 3DO to Matsushita, I think it's called, aka Panasonic. And he considers himself a winner, even though he did lose money. He also made $70 million with the recent selling. And he seems to be in a good position, working on the M2, but not having much to lose. But looking at the interview, he had a lot to say on the industry. And it's fascinating how right he is. I mean, he was at the time the biggest loser in the industry, considering the failure of the 3DO. But he nevertheless knows everything when it comes to this industry. He's obviously very smart and makes good choices. He is somewhat negative about the 32-bit systems. Maybe that was rhetoric, considering him wanting to sell the the M2 as a 64-bit system, but I can't blame him. He's right. At the time, the PlayStation games and the Saturn games weren't that impressive. That would take another year. So I wish I could tell you everything about what happens in this interview, but I don't have the time for that. But he definitely knows a lot about video game. I'm trying to find out if there's another snippet I found very interesting, because I know it's in here. I read this about a week ago. Oh well. I guess you'll just have to look up the magazine, issue 38, maybe online. Maybe you can get it on eBay. Also interesting talk about how M2 almost worked with Sega, but that there was just too much pride, apparently, for both companies. A lot of talk about DVD being the difference. He wants to make the M. It's kind of funny because in that sense he's somewhat hypocritical. He first says that the 3DO wasn't enough of a games machine, and now he talks about the M2 being three things at once: a internet machine, a DVD machine, and a games machine. So he's sort of making the same mistake. On the other hand, the PlayStation 2 definitely benefited from being able to play DVDs. Internet wasn't up to par at the time yet, though. The Xbox would have a modem, and hardly anybody used that except for Xbox Live, of course. Here's Ecstatica 2, mostly known for being the alone-in-the-dark-like game, not using polygons, but with epsiloids, which are all round, giving a more organic look, and I like to believe also higher frame rates. So the game looked pretty well, but it was still nevertheless quite niche. It's hard to find that much information about the game. Edge would later give it a 7, which is above average, but still not that impressive. GameSpot would give it a 7.9. So pretty nice for a action-adventure game, but not too special, and probably not deserving of 3 pages of preview. But that's Edge. They loved interviewing British developers and giving them lots of time, especially back then. Star Gladiator would be another 3D fighting game made by Capcom, not made by the people who made Street Fighter. It's with weapons. Other than that, not a big success, but very playable, just like all Capcom games. Mr. Tank, I couldn't find anything about this game. Years later, there would be a re-release of Battlezone with a modern technology, This game kind of looks like this, but Mr. Tank itself, no, couldn't find anything about this. Again, made in England. A lot of vaporware looked at by Edge back in the mid-90s. At least those games made in Europe. Psychic Force was a fighting game by Taito. Hardly any information on it any now. Got subpar reviews at the time as far as I know, but has a bit of a cult following, I've come to understand. Queen - the Eye. Yes, based on the band. Couldn't find that much information about this game either online, but apparently kind of a interactive experience using a lot of aesthetics from Queen the band. Wish I could tell you more about this game, but even the preview doesn't tell us much. Weird looking visuals though. Daytona USA, the Championship Circuit Edition, being re-released for the Saturn. Better graphics, way better graphics than the original, but then it had worse handling than the original Daytona USA, so nobody actually wanted it. It did have some extra tracks and cars. People just wanted the arcade version, but it just wouldn't work on the Saturn apparently. Now, Virtual-On, that's an underrated game, a arena-based fighting game. I loved the way there was a combination of projectiles and melee attacks. It was ported to the Saturn, and they did a fantastic job considering the hardware. The Saturn could never boast the 3D visuals of Virtual-On. They did a great job with Virtua Fighter 2, but that was just a fighting game. Virtual-On had, these huge arenas. Nevertheless, they got it working quite well. They also had to work around with the controller because the arcade game had 2 sticks. Now you had a pad. I believe there was a special controller made for it. Nobody had that, as far as I know. But it became a good port, and I really wish more people would play it because I like the setup. We now have ARMS, which is kind of close to the same idea, but Virtual-On was still had a lot more going for it. Here's a Namco race game. I think it's Rage Racer. Looking at the graphics, well, more of the same. Dual Heroes was released for the Nintendo 64, kind of a bland fighting game made by Hudson Soft with funny looking characters. I gotta hurry up a little bit. So let's go through these advertisements. Oh yeah, here's an article which I didn't even bother to read fully. It's about the future sound of gaming or something. Well, if you ask me, it was the sound of 1996. And all that's all that. There's even a whole page reviewing all the different songs for 2097 Wipeout. Who cares about that, only people in England could be so interested in this kind of thing happening. There's some talk about Xeon Train, the pooling sounds. I looked at that and I've already forgotten what it's about. I'm sorry for doing such a bad job, but this is, to me, very backwards. Video games are about interactivity and not about spectacle. And especially not spectacle used from other media. So here's half a page dedicated to some interactive music header, some kind of funky program to make video clips, as far as I know. I don't care about that either. Let's look at the reviews. Fighting Vipers, made by Sega, mostly known for having wolves and armor, and of course Pepsi Man. Gets an 8 out of 10. I agree with that. It played really well, although at the time we had Tekken and Virtual Fighter and Soul Edge, so why did we didn't really feel like playing Fighting Viper, especially not for the Saturn. So it's a shame. Sega deserved better, but they should have created more genres than only fighting games and racing games. Speaking of racing games, here's 2097, getting 3 pages. It is an improvement over the original Wipeout, which was way too difficult. Here the levels are somewhat bigger, less punishing, even better music. If I ask me if that's an important part of Wipeout, I have to admit. Yeah, I think it's a great game to use under influence of drugs. It's a party game in a sense, but then a party game by yourself. It gets an 8 out of 10. It is the peak of Wipeout's performance. Wipeout 3 wouldn't be that big. Wipeout for the PlayStation 2 would fly under the radar. Wasn't that good. It felt kind of sluggish. And it kind of got revived by the handheld versions. But yeah, Wipeout. It's so 1996. Looking at the design, and it's awesome. It's great. But yeah, it was at the time probably the best-selling game for the PlayStation 1, at least in Europe. Quake being finally released, although I feel like Edge was only looking at the beta or something, because they keep talking about the game as if it wasn't finished. And by then you could already play multiplayer, so what else did you want? This is the final boss, if I recall correctly. So in that sense, it's a complete game. Look, Quake single player wasn't that very interesting. It was all about playing as other people and applying mods. And I don't think the finished product was worth a 9, but what other people later did with the game was fantastic, making a very important game for the industry. Although Doom had even a bigger following, and later Unreal's engine would turn out to be better than the Quake 2 engine for that kind of thing. Here's Metal Slug, only getting a 6 out of 10. Quite rare, quite odd for such a classic, but they say the game's really short, and I have to admit it is on the short side. Although I think the game should have got an 8 because it is a fantastic run and gun platforming shooting game. Check it out if you can. This is not the end of the reviews, but halfway through they start discussing new media, where they have the Simpsons game and the Batman game, which aren't really games. They are animation studios of sorts. Some kind of CD with extra information about Independence Day, the biggest movie of 1996. We have a Nikon digital camera, quite the thing back then. I wonder how big the images could be made, but it doesn't tell us, right? You could fit 2 MB of pictures though on one of these cameras, so I don't expect very high resolutions. Some kind of CD player. Oh, there's mangas, Insectors, and Burn Up W. Email Love Story they find very bad. The Fugitive Game. Some music. I don't know these bands, and I don't care. Okay, back to review. Street Fighter Zero 2. If you ask me, the best fighting game in the Alpha/Zero series. 18 fighters. Street Fighter 3 had more fighters, but this game had better balance, and that's ultimately a more important thing. Looked fantastic animation-wise, even though it used the CP2 board. Very good conversion for the Super Nintendo, by the way. So, yeah, Street Fighter Zero 2. Forgotten at the time. Alpha 3 eventually became more popular. But that didn't turn out to be that popular either, at least for the hardcore fighting enthusiasts. That makes sense, because it didn't add that much to the genre. Mostly super meters. I didn't like that part. There were also alpha counters. I didn't like that part either. And, of course, the custom combos, which I didn't like that much either, too. So I'd still rather play Super Turbo these days. Keep it to the fundamentals. Here's Syndicate Wars. Gets a 9 out of 10. A sequel to Syndicate. A classic at the time. Not many people were interested in Syndicate games, and it's hard to find much information about this game. It did get really good reviews, but not by everybody. I guess at the time people wanted to play Quake. And if you wanted to be very strategic, you would play UFO, Enemy Unknown. The arcade games, Jetwave, which is made by Konami. And you could actually stand in the Wave Racer. That was cool. Fighters Impact looks very generic, made by Taito. Street Fighter Gaiden, aka EX, the sluggish 3D, 2D fighting game. Kind of like Alpha, but just less polished. Okay, so we have some arcade classics now by Nichibutsu. Do you know them? I feel like I should know them, but I honestly don't recognize these games. Mooncresta, Frisky Tom, SFX, Crazy Climber. I don't know any of these games. Wow. I should have looked into this, because I love researching old games I don't know. Yeah, I guess I'll do this afterwards. What's the name of the company? Yeah, Nichibutsu. Never heard of them. Space Harrier gets a full-page retro view. and they comment on how easy the game is. As long as you keep moving, preferably in a circular motion, you'll never get hit and just be able to blast everything. On the other hand, this game looked fantastic in the arcades back in the day. When was this released? 1986 or something? Does it say? This was maybe before Afterburner. And I remember Star Fox coming out in 1993, and people were like, "Ooh, this looks so fantastic." And I kept thinking, but, I mean, the Genesis is Space Harrier 2. I mean, to me, this game is aged better than Star Fox. I mean, graphical-wise. Now, Space Harrier is a rather simple game, gameplay-wise, but you can say the same thing about Star Fox, if you ask me. Alright. Lots of career opportunities back in the day. I'll show you all of them in case you're interested. Game Master, they're still around. They had a TV show, Games Master, in the early 90s. On to the letters. Well, some discussion about how good the Nintendo 64 is, and people are really loving it. So talk about how can we make games for people with disabilities. And let's see, somebody saying that games nowadays aren't as good as they used to be. Well, that's true, especially in 1996. And there should be more 2D games. Somebody saying, "Hey, come on, we shouldn't forget them." And Edge simply saying, "Well, buy them instead of buying Quake." Well, that's going to be hard, of course, because Quake was awesome. One stunning letter about somebody saying, "Yeah, you know, I prefer to buy games that are copied because they're way cheaper. How dare companies ask £60 for a Super Nintendo game?" And Edge goes into the offense saying it's because of people like you that games are so expensive. You shouldn't be copying them. You're basically stealing them. Shame on you. And somebody writing about, what was it again? Oh yeah, this guy works for Tao, who were on the cover of Edge, number 7 or so. Making some kind of system to unite different programming languages. And there's some talk about the graphical possibilities of different programs for the PC. And basically saying Videologic was the best at the time. And I think they are still one of the best. I'm not sure though. Now, Q&A still talks about NTC and PAL differences, ho-hum, but also about how you can hook up a Nintendo 64, getting the best graphics. Can they do, S-Video? No, apparently it's really hard. I didn't care at the time. I still don't care that much about graphics, to be honest. Although, when I play Nintendo 64 on an emulator, I find they look much better. But that's probably because of the lack of Z-buffering, which made everything kind of hazy. And something about track and field on the PlayStation 1. Oh yeah, asking about whether a special controller will be released for that, and you're probably not. Next month, we'll be looking at Apple again as a video game computer. Well, we know how that ended. It still wouldn't make it. And in case you're wondering what the answer is to the riddle, what runs along a cliff but never moves, it is, of course, Edge. Haha. So yeah, next month about Apple, late 1996. Exciting times where we have a 3-way battle between the Saturn, PlayStation, and Nintendo 64 at full strength. I'm looking forward to the next Nintendo 64 game. I wonder what Edge will think of it. Probably Turok. I remember Edge loving Turok. And Edge is going to love Final Fantasy VII. Although that's not going to be released for another year. Oh yeah, Tomb Raider is big. And that's pretty much it for the PlayStation 1. I think Tekken 2, Resident Evil 2 maybe? Well, we'll see what happens. So that was Edge 38. See you later.